Today's daf is daf Ayin Tes. We'll start with the Mishnah on the bottom of Ayin Ches Amid Beis. And the basic principle that serves as the background for our understanding is that the shechita of the carbon toda is makadesh the lechem. And we discussed at great length that there are 40 lechamim, and at what point in time do these lechamim receive kiddush? And the answer is after the shechita. Our Mishnah here is going to address the question when the shechita was a shechita psula. For example, shchata chutz lizmana. He had in mind when he did the shechita that the carbon toda would be eaten tomorrow. Or chutz limkoma, he had in mind that the toda would be eaten outside of the choma, the bounds of Yerushalayim. Now, carbon toda is a carbon shlamim, and shlamim is nechal b'chol ha'ir, in the entire city. There's a pella of a Rashi over here. The Rashi seems to indicate that he had in mind chutzum koma, that the toda would be eaten outside the azara. Very difficult. Maybe Rashi means that the shechita itself was done outside the azara. In any event, in all these cases that we discussed, kidesh halechem, the shechita, even though it's a shechita psula, but nevertheless, it is mekadesh the lechem. Now, the chiddush here is even chutz limkoma. I'm sorry, the chiddush here is even chutz lizmana. Why? Because the difference between chutz lizmana and chutz limkoma is that chutz lizmana generates pigul with an iser kares. And nevertheless, even though we're talking about pigul as a result of the shechita of chutz lizmana, nevertheless, it's mekadesh the lechem, which means that if the lechem is taken out of the azara, it becomes posel biyotze. Or if the lechem isn't eaten by the end of the day, it becomes posel midin lina. So even a case of chutz lizmana, which generates pigul with an iser kares b'achilaso, nevertheless, it is mekadesh the lechem. And the reason for that is because at the time of the shechita, let's say when he started the shechita, it was a shchitas kachim, and only after the shechita, with a machshava of shalol lizmana, chutz limkoma, did it become possible. However, by contrast, shchata v'nimtzeis treifa. Now, even though we find that it's treifa after the shechita, when we check the animal and its insides, but nevertheless, it was already a treifa at the time of the shechita. So in that case, lo kidesh halechem, because the shechita itself was already a shechita psula, and the paslus of tarfus was already chal before he did the shechita. And such a shechita, which has a paslus, it's an invalid shechita, could not possibly generate a sanctification of the lechem. Shchata v'nimtzeis balas mum. Now, once again, the logic here should dictate that lo kiddush halechem, which is in fact the shita the chachamim, lo kiddush. But to our surprise, Rabbi Eliezer Omer kiddush. Now, how could this shchita sanctify the shtel lechem when the shchita was psula? Again, we may have found out about the mum only subsequent to the shchita, but at the time of the shchita, the animal was already a balas mum, and that makes it similar to the case of treifa. So the disqualification was there already in motion at the time of the shechita. We didn't know about it, but now we found out about it. So we're going to have to figure out what is the logic that motivates Rabbi Eliezer to say kiddush. Shchata shelo lishma. Now here, he did the shechita shelo lishma. Like, for example, he had in mind that this toda should be an ola. And another case in the Mishnah, we'll see the din in a second, is v'chein el hamiluim v'chein shnei kivsei atzeres sheshchaton shelo lishman lo kidesh halechem. So we mentioned that at the time of the miluim, there were karbanos shlomim that were called el hamiluim from a ram, and of course on Shavuos to accompany the shtei lechem there were two kvasim, and in all these cases the shechita was done shelo lishma, and the Mishnah paskins in all these cases lo kidesh halechem. And the Gemara is going to have to derive this from a pasuk, because logically we would say that there's almost a kal v'chomer here. In a case of a machshavas pigul like chutz zmano, or a machshava poselos like chutz limkoma, we say that at the time of the shechita it was still kosher, and it only became posel as a result of the shechita, after the shechita. Therefore, it's mekadesh the lechem. Why shouldn't we apply the same logic to a case of shechita shelo lishma? The Gemara says, Masnisin Mani, our Mishnah, the way it presents the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, is only according to one tradition, and that's the tradition of Rabbi Meir. And we'll soon see that there's an entirely different tradition as to what the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, which is the Chachamim is a reference to Rabbi Yeshua, is all about. So first we start with Rabbi Meir. Desanya, we learned in the Brisa. Zeh klal. Kol shepisulo kodem shchita lo kiddush halechem. So for example, if the animal was posel midin the passus of tarfus before the shchita, we didn't know about it, but it was, then lo kiddush halechem. Why? Because the shchita does not have the power to generate a kiddush on the lechem, since the shchita itself is psula. However, pisula li'achar shchita, for example, in the case where he had a machshava of chutz zman or chutz komo, is kiddush halechem. Shchata chutz zman or chutz komo, kiddush halechem, and that again is an application of the principle of pisulo li'achar shchita. Shchata v'nimtzeis treifa lo kiddush halechem. Why? Because that fits into the first klal in the brisa of pisulo kodem shchita. The animal was already psula as a treifa, and tarfus is a poseles before the shchita. Again, as I emphasized over and over again, we didn't know about it, but we found out about it, and now we know that at the time of the shchita, the carbon was already posel because it was a treifa. And now we start today's daf ayin tes. All this is the shitas chachamim, which we said was intuitive. And on the top of daf ayin tes, amid al shchata v'nimtzeis balas mum, is, according to Rabbi Meir's presentation, the chachamim, who are identified here as Rabbi Yeshua, are going to say lo kiddush. Because it's again a case of pisulo kodem shchita. The fact that we know now it's a balas mum indicates that it was a balas mum at the time of the shchita, and therefore there's a passus of mum, and it cannot be mekadesh the lechem. But Rabbi Eliezer omer kiddush, and all this is divrei Rabbi Meir. This is the way Rabbi Meir presents the machlokes, and it's identical to the way the Mishnah had presented the machlokes. And now we're going to leave Rabbi Meir on the side, and we're going to take up Rabbi Yehuda, who has an entirely different transmission of this machlokas. So just to summarize, Ad Kan, the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer has to be understood because he is distinguishing between Nimtzeis Treifa on the one hand, which is low Kiddush, and Nimtzeis Balmum, which on the other hand is Kiddush. And why would Rabbi Eliezer make that distinction? What justifies the fact that if we now find out after the shechita that the animal was a balsmum, nevertheless it's makadesh when the shechita itself was psula? So that we don't know. And now we have another presentation of the Machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda. Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua al sheshchata v'nimtzeis treifa shelo kidesh. So far, so good. No, there's no new curveballs here because nimtzeis treifa is pisulo kodem shchita and therefore lo kidesh. And now we're saying that everybody agrees to that, which is true even according to Rabbi Meir's presentation. But here's where the going gets a little bit rough. V'al chutzlas mano, there's no machloks v'al chutzlas mano shekidesh. Now notice that the emphasis here is on chutzlas mano. What is being omitted here from the discussion is chutzlim komo. And we said that in chutzlas mano, it was pisulo liachar shchita, and therefore it's kidesh. L'chora, at the first glance, we should apply that same logic consistently to the case of chutzlim komo. Vaita, v'al balmum shelo kidesh. So now Rabbi Yoshua has one up it on Rabbi Meir, because with Rabbi Meir we got stuck with Rabbi Eliezer. We didn't understand how Rabbi Eliezer could make a distinction between Nimtzeis Treifa on the one hand and Nimtzeis Balmum on the other hand. To say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if it was a Balmum Kidesh, why? So now we're saying, according to Rabbi Yehuda's presentation, that everybody agrees in the case of Balas Mum, Shelo Kidesh, because Balas Mum is going to be identical with Nimtzeis Treifa. So Alma Nechleku, what is the subject of the Machlokes? Al Chutzlim Komo. And that's what we asked before. If Chutzlis Mano is Makadish the Lechem, because it wasn't a psul at the time of the Shechita, then Chutzlim Komo likewise should be Makadish the Lechem. And now things go topsy-turvy, because now, according to Rabbi Yehuda's presentation, Dafka Rabbi Eliezer has the upper hand. He's intuitively more logical, and he says Kiddush, which is exactly what we said before about Chutzlas Mano. But for some reason, Rabbi Yeshua Omer lo Kiddush. Rabbi Yeshua is going to argue that in a case of a machshav of Chutzlas Mano, scratch that. In a case of a machshav of Chutzim Komo, lo Kiddush. Why? So just to summarize, where we're holding now is that according to Rabbi Meir's presentation, where the Machlokes focuses on the case of Nimtzeis Balas Mum, we didn't understand Rabbi Eliezer. How could he say Kiddush? Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda's presentation, the Machlokes is about Chutzim Komo. And once again, we don't understand how Rabbi Yeshua could say Lo Kiddush. Rabbi Eliezer. So now, Rabbi Yehuda is going to analyze this Machlokes. We start with Rabbi Eliezer. And I say again and again that Rabbi Eliezer in Rabbi Yeshua's presentation is intuitive. It's logical. Hoil v'chutzis mano posel v'chutzim komo posel ma chutzis mano kodesh af chutzim komo kodesh. So far, Rabbi Eliezer makes 100% sense, and he's saying that we should equate chutzis mano and chutzim komo. And if chutzis mano is still able to be a kaddish, I would almost add a kavla chomer. How much more so chutz limkomo, which is on a lower level of psul, should certainly be able to mekadosh the lechem. And the reason is because it's pisulo liachar shchita. Rabbi Yoshua. Now Rabbi Yehuda has to explain Rabbi Yoshua's position, who says that if we find out it's a balasmum, sorry, just 1 second. I'm sorry, scratch that. That was Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yeshua is saying that in the case of chutzum komo lo kiddush, what's the difference now, according to Rabbi Yeshua in Rabbi Yehuda's formulation, between chutz lizmano and chutzum komo? Omar Rabbi Yeshua, hol v'chutzum komo posel ubalmum posel. Rabbi Yehuda presents in Rabbi Yeshua a favoritism, if I could use that word, in favor of comparing chutz limkomo to balas mum. So Rabbi Yeshua is dropping the equation that Rabbi Eliezer was insisting on between chutz limkomo and chutz zmano. Now we're going to take chutz limkomo and we're going to equate it with balas mum. And therefore, ma bal mum lo kiddush, af chutz limkomo lo kiddush. Omalo Rabbi Eliezer, I don't get it. What's your logic, Rabbi Yeshua? Ani demisihu lechutzizmano. My analogy between chutzim komo and chutzizmano makes a lot of sense. V'ata demisu lebal mum. And now you want to equate chutzim komo with bal mum? How could it be? I mean, bal mum is psulo kodem shchita, whereas chutzim komo, like chutzim mano, is psulo liachar shchita. Nira lemi dome. And now Rabbi Eliezer is trying to solidify his analogy by saying, im dome lechutzim mano nidunena michutzim mano. If we're going to equate chutzim komo with chutzim mano, so then it should be makadesh, like chutz lizmano. Im dome lebal mum, nidunena lebal mum. Meaning, you would be right, Rabbi Yoshua, if I would grant you the premise that we should equate chutzlim komo with balmum. In the sense, the basic analogy is that they're both possible. So these are the two options. Do we equate chutzim komo with chutzim mano or chutzim komo with balmum? Hiskil Rabbi Eliezer ladun. So Rabbi Eliezer now, he has these two possibilities. Let's figure out which one is correct. Done in psul machshava. In both cases of chutz limkomo and chutz lizmano, we're talking about a psul machshava. That has nothing to do with a balmum. Ain't done in psul machshava. You cannot equate chutz limkomo with a machshava poseles with psula guf with the case of balmum. So now Rabbi Yehuda is going to quote Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua is going to go back to the drawing board to the point at which we have two options in terms of chutz limkomo, whether to equate it with chutz lizmano or with Balas Mum. Rabbi Eliezer had already laid down his argument that it's more logical to equate it with chutz le zmano because that's a psul machshava, not a psul aguf. Hiskel Rabbi Yeshua dun in psul she'en bo kares mi psul she'en bo kares. V'al yochiach chutz zmano she'psul she'esh bo kares. Well, now, Rabbosai, I have to tell you this. At this point, I believe that Kodshim becomes very technical. And I've said this to you many, many times. I'm limited in my, how do they say, my pay scale. I can't find an inherent logic to this line in the Gemara in which Rabbi Yehuda quotes Rabbi Yoshua with an analogy that has to do with the chiyuv kares or the absence of chiyuv kares. That should make no difference. And in fact, if in the case of chutz l'zmanu, which generates kares, be midin pigul, even Rabbi Yoshua has to agree kidesh, that it's makadosh the lechem. Isn't it a kal v'chomer in a case of a psul she'ein bo kares? How much more so it should be makadosh the lechem. But no, Rabbi Yeshua comes up with a technical, how should I say, it seems to me to be totally mechanical. Balas mum does not generate pigo with a chiyuv kares. Chutz l'mkomo, although it passes the carbon like a balas mum, but it doesn't generate kares, and they two belong together. So therefore, just like in the case of balas mum, lo kidesh, so too in the case of chutz l'mkomo, lo kidesh. The ode, in other words, let me add another point on top of the point that I made until now, says Rabbi Yeshua. Nidunenu mishalo lishma. What do we say about shalo lishma? If you recall, let's go back to the Mishnah for a moment. The Mishnah said, Shchata shalo lishma lo kidesh halechem. So therefore, let's equate chutzim komo with shalo lishma. And both of them have the basic common denominator of psul machshava. And both of them, going back to Rabbi Yeshua's first argument, have the common denominator that ein bo kares. Now, it's interesting because ein bo kares, in the case of machsheves shalo lishma, sort of like underestimates the halacha. The halacha is that the carbon is kosher in shalo lishma, with the exception of chatos or pesach. So therefore, if you shech the toda shalo lishma, the carbon is still kosher. It's eina ola l'baylam l'shem chova. They'll have to replace the carbon. So certainly there's no kares. So basically, the V'od of Rabbi Yeshua leads us back to square one, and we were very perplexed about the sefer of our Mishnah. Why is a shalo lishma situation lo kidesh? Why is lo kidesh? But again, granted, as I state in the Mishnah, we can't erase the Mishnah that shalo lishma is not makadosh the lechem. Then we have two basic similarities, argues Rabbi Yeshua, between chutz l'mkomo and shalo lishma. Number one, they're both psulei machshava. And number two, they're both absent a chiyuv kares, meaning a chal shem pig. Bishosak Rabbi Eliezer. Now it seems from these three words in the Gemara that Rabbi Eliezer rescinded his original position, namely that chutzim komo should be considered like chutz lizmano, and it should be makadesh the lechem. But no, he's going to accept the equation based on the absence of kares in chutzim komo to nimtzeis treifa, or alternatively to shalolishma, and he's going to accept the position that chutzim komo lo kiddush halechem. Okay, ad kan Rabbi Yehuda. Now we go back to Rabbi Meir. Again, in Rabbi Meir's formulation, we had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer says that in the case of Balas Mum, Kiddush, why is it any different than Nimtzeis Treifa? My Shnosh Chotov Nimtzeis Treifa, I'm skipping a few words for a second, Umay Shnosh Chotov Nimtzeis Balas Mum. Meaning that just like we said that in the case of Nimtzeis Treifa, Lo Kiddush, and the reason why Lo Kiddush is Davi Psulo Kodem Shchita. How's that different in the case of Nimtzeis Baal Mum? Question mark, do lo havi psul kodem shchita? It's a rhetorical question. So how, and this was our question from the get-go on Rabbi Eliezer, on Rabbi Meir's presentation of Rabbi Eliezer. How could Rabbi Eliezer make a distinction between Nimtzeis Treifa, where we say Lo Kiddush, because Pisulo Kodem Shchita, to the case of Nimtzeis Balas Mum, which again is Pisulo Kodem Shchita, and yet Rabbi Eliezer argues that Kiddush. So the Gemara answers that Nimtzeis Balas Mum is not what you think it is. It's not that we discovered some sort of a puncture in the lungs, which we found out after the shechita and we checked out the animal. But it's a special kind of psul in the cornea of the eye of the animal. And that's called bidokin sheba'ayin. So exactly where this psul in the eye is located is a matter of controversy. It could be, it's what we call a cataract. It blurs the vision. It might be something that relates to the spots in the pupil of the eye. But we have to introduce Rabbi Akiva. I'll leave it to Rabbi Akiva. What is Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva says that this bedukin sheba'ayin is different than any other mum, and has that express itself im olu lo yerd. That even though once you discover that there's bedukin sheba'ayin, you cannot be maktir the basar al gabi mizbeach. If he went ahead and he brought it onto the top of the mizbeach, kiddush. The top of the mizbeach is makadesh, and therefore lo yerdu, we could burn it on the mizbeach. So let's ask the following question. According to Rabbi Akiva, bedukin sheba'ayin, is it possible or is it not possible? L'chatchila, we would throw it out. Send it to the Beis Hapsul, or let it stay overnight, and then you get rid of it when it becomes possible in Lina. On the other hand, Rabbi Akiva seems to say that this bedukin sheba'ayin is not a psul of Baal Mum, because in the case of Baal Mum, olu yerdu. But in the case of bedukin sheba'ayin, according to Rabbi Akiva, im olu lo yerdu. So lo yerdu seems to indicate that there's still a possibility of kiddush, and by putting it on top of the mizbech is mekadesh it, and therefore we need to burn it on the mizbech, and that's called lo yerd. How would this shed light on Rabbi Eliezer according to the transmission of Rabbi Meir? Because Rabbi Eliezer said that nimtzeis balas mum kidesh, and the answer is don't misunderstand Rabbi Eliezer. He agrees that nimtzeis balas mum lo kidesh, like nimtzeis treifa lo kidesh, a psul neguf, and it's kodem shchita. But rather, we're talking about a very specific kind of a blemish, which is called bedukin shabayin, and according to Rabbi Akiva, that's not a real blemish. That's not a real mum. And the proof of the pudding is because him olu lo yerd. Rabbi Yeshua, why didn't Rabbi Yeshua accept this possibility that at least if you go with Beduk Shabayin according to Rabbi Akiva, then the principle should be Kiddush? And the answer is Ki Amar Rabbi Akiva Im Olierdu Bipsula de Gufe Aval Kedusha de Lechem Lo. Rabbi Yeshua says you're misunderstanding Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva didn't go as far as to say that there's no psul of balmum in the case of Bedukin Shaba'ayin. Rabbi Akiva concedes that there is a psul of balmum in the case of Bedukin Shaba'ayin, and therefore it would be lo kidesh. So argues Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Akiva was only interested in a different halacha of im olu lo yerd. So the language here of the Gemara, Ki Amar Rabbi Akiva, I'm going to go over it one more time, Im olo yerd bipsula de gufe. In other words, when Rabbi Akiva was evaluating all the cases of a balmum, like in an anatomy class, and he came up with a distinction between Beduk and Shabayin on the one hand and all the other mumim on the other hand, he came to the conclusion that as far as the halacha psul guf is concerned, we're going to make that distinction. And we're going to say that Beduk and Shabayin is not a full-fledged mum. Hence, im olu lo yerd. But that the shchita of a balmum, in the case of Beduk, even in the case of Beduk Shvain, should have the power to be Makadosh the Lechem, says Rabbi Yeshua, that far Rabbi Akiva didn't go. Itma. Chata se shchata chutz lizmana. Okay. So now, we're going to assume the following premise, that chutz lizmana, again, I don't know what language to use here, so pardon the coarse language here, but it's a worse psul, it's more stringent of a psul than chutzim koma. Haraya, it generates pigul. And nevertheless, im also lotere, which when you think about it is a pella. We're talking about pigul, a machshava mefagelis, and yet im also lotere. So he writes here in the note, but again, I'm not equipped to analyze this. He says a pigul offering has a certain degree of validity, like working with Xeris HaKos. Again, another one of those technical rules in Kodshin. Now we get to Chutzim Koma. Now, if you're going to tell me that in Chutz's Mano, where it's a Machshavas Pigul, there's a certain degree of validity, as we saw here, and therefore im also lo tered, then how much more so in the case of Chutzim Koma, where there's no Pigul? So if we fast forward to Rabbah, for example, Rabbah Omar lo tered. We accept the equation between Chutzim Komo and Chutz's Mano, almost with a Kal V'chomer. But Rava Omar Tered. What sense can we make out of Rava? So the Gemara is about to introduce what we call in modern Hebrew a tlut. Tlut means interdependence, making the matching. And the Gemara is going to equate the sheet of Rava of lo tered, of tered, with the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua. Because it was Rabbi Yeshua who equated Chutzim Komo with Balas Mum in a twofold sense. Number one, they're both absent kares. And number two, they're both similar to Machshava Shelo Lishma. So the Gemara says the following: Rava ki Rabbi Yeshua. Rava, who says that Chutzim Koma is a full-fledged psul haguf, and paradoxically, it's more puzzle than Chutz's Mano. But Chutz's Mano, we say, even according to Rabbah, even according to Rava and Rabbi Yeshua, im all lo tered. But in Chutzim Koma, we're going to say im all lo tered. Like the case of Balas Mum. But Rabbah is Rabbi Eliezer, and we can accept the analogy, the equation between Chutz's Mano and Chutzim Komo, insofar as both are Psulei Machshava, and not similar to Balas Mum, which is a Psul Guf. And in the context of that equation, we're going to say that Chutzim Komo is im Olo Lo Tered. That's the Shita of Rabbah. V'hodar be Rabbah legabi Rava. Now we're going to assume that Rabbah is going to retract his original position, and he's going to accept the equation between Chutz Limkoma and Nimtzeis Treifa. I'm sorry, Nimtzeis Balas Mum. And therefore, in both cases, Im Ola Tered, accepting Rava. And why is that? We already saw later that Rabbi Eliezer kowtowed and accepted all the arguments of Rabbi Yeshua, retracted his position. Ika Diamri, others say, okay, Rabbi Eliezer was very impressed by the arguments of Rabbi Yeshua and he pulled out, but Rabbi Legabi Rava lo hadarbe. Why? Why is it that Rabbi insisted that he is still correct, and that in Chutz L'Mekoma im Ola lo tered Chasam who? Why is it that in the Machlokes Tanoim as to whether or not the Shechita was Makadish the Lechem, we had the second argument of Rabbi Yeshua. That was the KTO. Because Rabbi Yeshua says, what about Shalol Lishma? And Shalol Lishma, the Mishnah says, is outspoken. It is lo kiddush alechem. Aval hacha, I dainis le mishalol Lishma, im also lo terid. Here you cannot pull a fast one and introduce Shalol Lishma, because then you're going to have to admit that lo terid. So therefore, Rabbah is going to insist that we should take Shalol Lishma, take Chutz Limkoma, and either equate it with Chutz Lizmana insofar as him also lo tered, or equate it with Shchita Shalol Lishma, which is him also lo tered. The Mishnah says Shchata Shalol Lishma, and we said that doesn't make any sense. It's got to be based on some sort of pasuk. But right now, we don't know what the pasuk is. But the Mishnah went ahead and gave a case of the Ayel, the El Shlomim of Miluim, and the case of the Kivsei Atzeres. Then in both cases, if he had a Machshava Shalol Lishma, Lo Kiddush Halechem. So the El Hamiluim also has an accompaniment of Lechem, and for sure the Kivsei Atzeres of Shavuos are accompany the Shtei Lechem. Amar Rav Papa, Shavak Tana Didan El Nazir de Shchiach v'Noked El Hamiluim. Rav Papa points out that the Mishnah is a little bit odd. I mean, why mention a very strange case, which is only L'Shah, not L'Doros, of the El Hamiluim? Why not just take the case of El Nazir, which is Shchiach, meaning El Nazir is part of the Dorei Doros. Tana Didan Iker Milsa Nokat. So I think that Iker Milsa is more like a chronological comment, that we go back to the original biblical case of El Hamiluim as opposed to the El Nazir, which is post Sinai. The Mishnah says the following: Now we have the case of Nesachim. Nesachim would accompany the Korban Ola and the Korban Shlamim. Now, what is Makadesh the Nesachim? Two possibilities. It's either what we call Kiddush Kli, and the yayin is put into a kli shares, which is makadosh the yayin, or since it's an accompaniment to a zevach, the shchit of the zevach is makadosh the yayin. In the same way that in lechamim we say the kiddush, the sanctification of the lechamim is clinched by virtue of the shchit of the korban todah. So the Mishnah says, "Hanasachim shekidshu b'kli." V'nimtza zevach posel. The Mishnah sort of contradicts itself in the same breath. On the one, it says kidsha b'kli, and the other hand, the zevach is posel, which sounds like the kiddush of the nesachim is due to the zevach, meaning the shchitas hakorban, whether it's be the ola or the shlom. So what do we do in this case? So Mishnah says it depends. If somewhere in the Azara there's someone else who's bringing a korban ola or korban shlamim, then let this yayin, these nesachim, accompany his korban. Which sounds like the kiddush is in the kli. But in lav, then Ipaslu belina. There's no other korban. We cannot attach these nesachim to any other korban. So the kiddush is limited to the zvicha of the first korban, which turned out to be possible. So therefore, the kiddush itself of the nesachim, which is somehow bound up to the zevach, is now undermined. So really, we should throw it out immediately. But for some reason, and we've seen this in the past in Kodshim, that we leave it overnight, and then it becomes possibly din lina, and then we get rid of it. Omar Zeiri, Eina Nisachim Miskachim El B'Shchitas HaZeva. So that Rabbi Zera apparently is going to derive from the biblical exegesis that the Makadesh of Niskei Ayayin is going to be the Shchita of the Zeva. And as we said before, that parallels the case of Shchitas Toda to be Makadesh the Lachme Toda. And that would explain why, if he can't find another Zvicha, meaning another carbon that's being brought at that time, then the Kiddush of the Niskei Yain is undermined because the Zvicha was the Zvicha Psula. But my timer, where did Reb Zera get this from? He must have darshaned it in some biblical analysis. And the Gemara answers that we're going to look in the Pasuk in, I believe it's Parshas Emor, Vayikra Chav Gimel, Omar Kros Zevach U Nisachim. So the Nisachim comes after Zevach, so it's the Zevach that's Makadesh, the Nisachim. Frek the Gemara, I don't understand. What is Reb Zera going to do with that Mishnah? Tanan, Hanisachim Shekit Shuvekli, V'nim Zevach Pasul, If Yesh Zevach Acher Yikarvu Imilab, is Lanu Yipasu Velina. So what's going on over here? We're talking about a case of Nimtza Zevach Pasul. And according to you, Rabbi Zera, we have a pasuk that tells me that Zevach Venisko, meaning that it's the Zevach that's Makadesh. And if that Zevach was a Shchita Psula, then there's no Kiddush of the Nisachim. So how can you say we'll run around and look for another Bailim? My love to Ifsel B'Shchita. And the Shchita now, according to Rabbi Zera, could not engender a Kiddush on the Nisachim. And yet the Mishnah says that what are we going to do with this Niskei Yayin if we don't find any other customer available? We're going to leave it overnight so that it becomes Pasal Midin Lina. But that means that there was a Kiddush. So Rabbi Zera, you see from the Mishnah, the Kiddush of the Nesachah was effectuated by the Kli, not by the Shchita. And the Gemara says, Lo the Ifsal Bizrika. The problem with these Nesachim is that they cannot accompany this Zevach because there was a psul at the time of the Zrika. But at the time of the Shechita, there was no psul. So at the moment of Shechita, there was a Shechita Kshera, and Rabbi Zera argues that that Shechita Kshera generates a Kiddush of the Niskei Yayin. And now, if we cannot find an alternative Zevach, we're going to have to leave it for Lina, and there's a psul Lina on the Niskei Yayin because of the Kiddush of the Kli, even though there was no Kiddush. No, I'm sorry. Because of the Kiddush of the Shechita, because the psul was only at the time of the Zrika. So Gemara says, Kiman, Kirebi Dom Shnei Dvar Ma'matiri Ma'alim Zeblo Zeh. Right, we have two acts of Kiddush over here. We have the Kiddush of the Kli when the Nesachim were put into the Kli. We have the Kiddush of the Zevach with its Shechita. And what happens in a case where you have two Matirim, can each one function on its own? And the answer is that in this case, since the Shechita was a Shechita Kshera, so again, the assumption here is that there was a psul in the Zrika. Just 1 second. The psul in the Zrika. So if there's a psul in the zrika, then there was no kiddush kli. Like, let's say, for example, I think what the Gemara has in mind is that he shechted the carbon and the blood starts spurting out, and instead of receiving the blood in a kli shares, it spilled on the ground. So therefore, there was no kiddush kli, because normally there's a kiddush kli. But if we apply the principle of Rebbe, that if you have two matirim, then each one is ma'ala zeh below zeh. So then it makes sense that the shechita would generate a kiddush in the niskei hayayin, despite the fact that there was no kiddush kli, and therefore it's possible lino. Or it says nein. Afilu teim Rabbi Eliezer Reb Shimon, who argues against Rabbi, and he holds that what? That when you have two matirim, you need both matirim, and here to be makadosh the niskei hayayin, you need not only the shechita, but you need the kibul kli. Because he was makabel the dam in a kos. That kos is makadosh the dam. So he has both kiddushim, the kiddush of shechita and the kiddush of kli. V'nishma. And then the dam fell onto the ground, and now we don't know what to do with the niskei hayayin because they can no longer accompany this carbon, because carbon is possible because nishpach hadam.